All right, well, hey, everyone. Welcome to Thursday Night Greenhouse Gathering. Little different setting this week. Awesome setting. Thankful to be in. No, there's not going to be anything on the TV, but there could be a game or something on behind. I don't know. Afterwards, like a game of pool or something. If you know, you know. I'm just saying. That being said, all the way through, I'm thankful for the game of pool. But we're not going to be talking about pool tonight. We're going to be talking about Jonah. So as you get there, Jonah's almost at the end of the Old Testament. So if you want to get there faster, get to the book of Matthew and keep turning left, you'll run into Jonah. Or cut your Bible in half, get to Psalms, keep turning right, you'll get to Jonah. But we're going to talk about Jonah maybe in a little different light. So tonight we're going to talk about running in the right direction. So running in the right direction. So how many of us, when we were growing up, remember running away? Like wanting to run away. Did any of us ever run away? Uh-oh.
I hid under my bed for a while.
See? Like we would run away. So like but a lot of times you get to the end of the street and you would forget where you were going. Like that would be me. Like, where was I going again? Like, yeah, why would I leave such a place? But yet we spend a lot of our life doing that. As a matter of fact, the thing about Jonah we're going to talk through and talk about tonight is in life we're either running from something or running for something. It's a big difference when we look at life. And we're going to see in Jonah's life how it looks different when he was running from something versus when he was running for something. And that's where we can be in our life as we're going all the way through. So a little bit about the book of Jonah as we kick it off tonight is this. Jonah was written about 750 BC. 750 BC. We know that because of the things that are written in there. We know about the time frame, so a little bit of history there. In the book of Jonah, big fish is mentioned 4 times. Great city is mentioned 9 times. And last but not least, disobedience is mentioned 18 times. So what do you think is the most important and relevant thing to see from the book of Jonah when it's mentioned that many times, right? So that's what we have to see. There's also miracles sprinkled throughout it, but that's what we have to see about the book of Jonah, is it's really about us and God. And are we running from God or are we running for God? And so that's what we're going to see all the way through in the book of Jonah. It's going to be familiar to many of us, but it's going to be a little bit of a retelling and looking at it a little different way as we go in there. So tonight, Jonah 1, we'll be talking about running in the right direction. So if you're taking notes tonight, got 3 things for us. How to run in the right direction, and how do we know that? So running in the right direction. So number 1, if you're taking notes right now, if you want to be running in the right direction, the first thing to do is surrendering to God's will. We want to be surrendering to God's will. We can see that here in verse 1 through 3, how Jonah was not surrendered to God's will. He was not surrendering, to God's plan. I said God's will, surrendering to God's plan. You can cross that out. Same thing. God's plan, God's will. We'll get there. It'll make sense. So surrendering to God's plan. Verse 1 says this in Jonah 1, verse 1. The word of the Lord came to Jonah, son of Amittai. So Jonah means dove, believe it or not, in Hebrew. And his father's name, Amittai, or Amittai, however you want to say it. I did not get that study right on that, but wherever you want to say it. His name means truth. So his father's name means truth, and Jonah's name means dove. Now remember when Jesus was baptized, when the Holy Spirit descended like a dove? So you could see the sacrifice, the peace offering is so we see all these things rolling around when it comes to Jonah, how this is a story of us and God. So that's just verse 1 when we get there. Verse 2, go to the great city of Nineveh and preach against it because it is wicked, its wickedness has come before me. So, Nineveh, it's a Syrian city. Let me tell you what Assyria is happening in Assyria and what they're famous for. This is not what you want to be famous for. The Assyrians are famous for filleting people alive and them still walking around without skin. That is what they're known for. Barbarians, they were known as barbarians. It is how they spread fear. It is how they got people to continue to sit under their control. So Jonah is being caught in this city, but it's not that he is afraid of what they're going to do to him. It's actually Jonah thinks he's better than them. We're going to see that all the way through. So that's just verse 1 and 2. So we're talking about running the right direction, surrendering to God's plan. Verse 3 says this, but Jonah ran away from the Lord and headed to Tarshish. He went down to Joppa, where he found a ship bound for that port. After paying the fare, he went aboard and sailed for Tarshish to flee from the Lord. So, as we're looking at this and we're talking about surrendering to God's will, and we see what happens all the way through, is obviously where we can think our plans are better than God's, or we can try to run from what God wants to do. But when he set his will out, he's going to accomplish it one way or the other. 100%. I mean, he's the creator of the universe. So the best thing to do would be to surrender to what he's called you to do versus try to run. If you ever look this up on a map, I don't have a way to visually show that to you, but I would challenge you later, go home, look that up on a map, and see how far away that Jonah was going when he looked for a ship going from Tarshish to how close Nineveh was to where he was. I mean, it is like completely in the opposite, like hundreds of miles, if I remember right. Like, look it up on a map, and you're going to be like, there was effort to be made to try to run that far away. It wasn't like, I mean, he could have went to just on the outskirts of Nineveh. You know, he could have just went somewhere, you know, on the outskirts. No. He went so far away. And so that's why the Lord is going to reel him in. So why does that matter to us today all the way through? Well, we've all got a little Jonah in us. All of us have been running from God since the Garden of Eden. Like, remember, God came and he had to find Adam and Eve once they sinned, and they were running from God at that moment in time. And the thing for us is sometimes we think we can know better than God. I'm guilty of that, probably even more than I want to admit today. But isn't it better to trust his will than to be stuck in our own all the way through? Like, for all of us as we walk through this, the reason that it matters today is we want to run in full surrender to what God has called us to. So, why is that important when I say we're running? Because some of us would say, I can't run anywhere. You run, whether you believe it or not. The results of running are this. When you run from God, it costs you more than you're willing to pay. Like, obviously, it's going to cost Jonah more than he's willing to pay when it goes all the way through this. When you run from God, it costs you more than you're willing to pay. What I love about verse 3 is whenever we're running from God, it brings us in a certain direction. It says, but Jonah ran away from the Lord and headed to Tarshish. He went down to Joppa. Whenever we're running from God, we're going to go down to a place we shouldn't be versus him lifting us up. And so all the way through when we're running, we have to understand that the results of running is that. And when we're outside the will of God, where Jonah is going to be, a price is going to be paid and we're going to pay it. But when we're inside the will of God, a price is paid, and Jesus paid it. So the question is, do we want to be running from God and pay the price ourselves, or be running for God and let Jesus, who's already paid it, carry that for us? I don't know about you, but if it's already been paid for, I mean, wouldn't it be nice just to sail on through if it's already been paid for? So that's why it matters. The last but not least, the runners are the last one to connect the dots. Like, think about it. Most of the time, you see somebody in a race or you see somebody running, like, you're the last one to connect the dots. Jonah's going to connect the dots last of what's going on as this goes all the way through. So, number one, surrendering to God's will help us run in the right direction. Number two, waking up to God's purpose. Waking up to God's purpose. That's how we run in the right direction. We'll wake up to God's purpose. Let's look and see what happens between verse 4 and verse 11. And it says this. Then the Lord sent a great wind on the sea. Such a violent storm arose that the ship threatened to break up. All the sailors were afraid, and each cried out to his own God, and they threw cargo into the sea to lighten the ship. But Jonah had gone below deck, where he lay down and fell into a deep sleep. Disobedience always finds a pillow. Like, look at this storm in Jonah's life versus Jesus asleep on the storm with the disciples. Completely different. One is trying to get away from everything. The other is trying to show us what peace looks like all the way through it. So I look at this and I say, hey, Jonah finds a pillow, he sleeps. But think about these sailors. Their livelihoods they threw over just to try to save themselves. So Jonah's disobedience cost others more than he realized all the way through. So when we walk through this disobedience, we've got to not only, as we said, surrender to God's will, wake up in God's purpose. Let's look and see what happens in verse 6 through 9. It says this, the captain went to him and said, how can you sleep? Get up, call on your God. Maybe he will take notice of us and that we will not perish. Think about this. It's funny. Even the biggest atheist in the world becomes a Christian when the plane starts going down. They learn how to pray real quick. and I'm not trying to be mean, I'm just trying to be real. Maybe you say you're agnostic or atheist. It's not a pot shot. I'm glad you're here. Thank you for hanging out with us and learning about the Lord. But I'm going to tell you, all of us will start praying to God for something when something happens. Even people who don't believe in God. These sailors didn't believe in God at all, and they begged Jonah, hey, pray. You seem to have peace about this. We don't. Go pray about it. Goes on to say this. Then the sailors said to each other, come, let us cast lots to find out who is responsible for this calamity. That doesn't point to the cross. I don't know what happened. What else would? They cast lots, and the lot fell on Jonah. So they asked him, tell us, who is responsible for making all this trouble for us? What kind of work do you do? Where do you come from? What is your country? From what people are you? He answered, I am a Hebrew, and I worship the Lord, the God of heaven, who made the sea and the dry land. Verse 10 says, this terrified them, and they asked, what have you done? They knew he was running away from the Lord because he had already told them so. They already knew. He told them he was running from God, but yet he declared, and he was in religion, beating his chest like the Pharisees did, I'm better than you. So therefore, that's why this is happening. Even though I'm in disobedience, you're screwed and I'm not, kind of thing. And you're about to see this play out. It shows, honestly, the prejudice that Jonah had, but also what happens when we're stuck in dead religion. We'll talk about that in a second. But his dead religion caused him to walk in rebellion. He was so stuck in dead religion that he went in disobedience and rebellion because he thought he was religious enough. Verse 11, the sea was getting rougher and rougher, so they asked him, what should we do to make the sea calm down for us? And then we're going to see how Jonah picks that up. So as we see that all the way through, as Jonah is steeped in this dead religion and thinking he's got it all together, he's got it figured out. He's got God's plan figured out better than God does. And now all of a sudden these people are being tossed to and fro. These people are being affected left and right. We can see how dead religion plays out. Just a quick reminder. We know what this is. It's not going to be it's going to be a reminder for some of us. It's not going to be anything new, but it's just a reminder when we're running from God versus running for God. Dead religion in our life will always focus on the outward appearance more than it focuses on the inward. In other words, Jonah thought he was better than them, so he focused on what they looked like on the outside versus what they were on the inside. Dead religion will do that. It will always do that to us. And especially when we're running from God, it's crazy how we can point that out better than we can instead of loving someone right where they are. Number two, in dead religion, all the way through, it will always value rituals over relationship. Will always value the ritual over the relationship. So it'll focus on the outward over the inward. It'll focus on rituals over relationships. So when we say waking up to God's purpose was never for us to have all these rituals. Instead, it was always to have a relationship with him. Third thing it will do in dead religion is it will focus on sin more than the person. Sin more than the person. All the way through, Jonah was stuck in his dead religion, but even these sailors understood that there was something going on here that was greater than them. There was something that was happening. There was something that was wrong with each and every one of them. And so, for each and every one of us, as we dive into that, I wonder if we're stuck in dead religion or not. Because if we're stuck in dead religion, it will always lead to rebellion. And the thing is, it will slowly make us go down without even realizing it. And sometimes the crash in our life is God's grace upon us to rescue us from our dead religion. We're going to see that play out here in a second. So, number one, surrendering to God's plan. Number two, waking up to God's purpose. Number three, as we finish out the book of the first chapter of Jonah, I'm proud of us, we got through it. Here, verse 12, what does Jonah reply to when it says, how can they be saved? Pick me up and throw me in the sea, he replied, and it will become calm. I know that it is my fault that this great storm has come upon you. Like, think about that. How many of us would just go ahead and toss him overboard? I mean, like, right away. Like, you know that. But look at what the sailors did. Instead, the men did their best to row back to land, but they could not, for the sea grew even wilder than before. Even those sailors, they threw everything overboard. They made the ship as light as it possibly could be, but they themselves even tried to save Jonah. And dead religion will say that you can save yourself and that you can save others. But thank God for Jesus, because we don't have to. I'll give you number three here in a second. So all the way through. Instead, the men did their best to row back. to land, but they could not, for the sea grew even wilder than before. Verse 14, then they cried out to the Lord, please, Lord, do not let us die for taking this man's life. Do not hold us accountable for killing an innocent man, for you, Lord, have done as you pleased. Then they took Jonah, threw him overboard, and the raging sea grew calm. At this, the men greatly feared the Lord, and they offered a sacrifice to the Lord and made vows to him. In other words, they now at this moment in time believe that God is who he says he is, and these men get saved all even inside of Jonah's disobedience. God still does his work with these men. It's crazy, crazy awesome. Verse 17, I love this. Now the Lord provided. I don't know if you ever paid attention to that when it comes to this story. Now the Lord provided a huge fish to swallow Jonah, and Jonah was in the belly of the fish 3 days and 3 nights. So number 3, if you want to know you're running in the right direction, you got to fall into God's grace. Falling into God's grace is how you know you're running in the right direction. Falling into God's grace. So you got to surrender to God's plan, wake up to God's purpose, and be falling into his grace. Little did Jonah know that he was falling into God's grace when that ocean came. Like, think about this. Some folks would got to get into science to all this and say it's not possible that a big fish could do this and all this. But let me ask you this. Right now, we can have 300 men go into a metal vessel and spend months on end, almost touching the bottom of the ocean. We haven't got as deep as the bottom of the ocean, but can be underwater for a long time. We call that a submarine. Could we not fathom that in 750 BC, the very God of the universe could not have something there that is a huge fish or anything else that can make a man be alive for 3 days and 3 nights inside of it? If us and our capability can have 300 plus men do it, do we not think? So if you're science and you're struggling with that, I'm just saying, think about it. Maybe, just maybe, this is possibly happening because, and maybe it did, and maybe you thought it didn't happen. I'm telling you it did, but Jonah realized he had to fall into God's grace because think about this transport. He had this big boat across a raging sea, and what would get faster, men rowing on top of the water in a raging sea, or a fish that knew the way back to Nineveh? A fish all day long, right? And think about how crazy calm that was. I don't know how it smelled. I'm just saying. I don't know what anything else was. But I mean, like, think about that. God's grace. I always pay attention to that verse 17. Now the Lord provided. Like, think of that. The Lord still provided a way for a miracle to happen inside of Jonah's disobedience. And he does that for us if we're in Christ Jesus. Sometimes we do it kicking and screaming, and other times it takes somebody just throwing us in the ocean. The difference is that I love in this story as we go on, as I think about running in the right direction, I look at Jesus asleep on that boat, and I look at Jesus on the water, and I look at Peter, and I look at Jonah. Peter stepped out of that boat in faith and walked on water. Jonah was thrown in that water, and God still provided a way for him, and it wasn't in faith because he was so bitter in himself. If you want to know if you're running in the right direction, when you step out on that boat, if you're walking on water, you're going the right way. If you're sinking, then maybe, just maybe, God's going to bring you the right way, but maybe, just maybe, you were going the wrong direction in the first place, and God provided a way for you to get back in the right direction. Because either way, a step of faith is going to be so much better than somebody else throwing you in there in the wrong direction in that sea. So for each and every one of us, I want us to see all the way through that happened, because so many times in our life, what it made me think of is David in Psalm 139:17 talks about how we can't get away from God. Everywhere God goes, he is there. So wherever we're running, if we're running in the wrong direction, God's already at the place where we think we're running from him to, or running from him from. I don't know if that's grammatically correct, but I said it. All the way through. He's already there. The question is, will we just receive him? Will we surrender to his plan? Will we sit in his purpose? Because Jonah's life played out terrible. He's a great evangelist. He's a prophet, and prophets would come down and they would tell people what they didn't want to hear. That was the whole point of being a prophet. They went to people and told them about their sin. They went to people and told them about where they were stuck. And see, the thing is, the only thing I see Jonah talking about in the beginning is himself. Now, we can talk about ourselves, but it's our story and how Jesus changed us, because he's the hero of our story, Jonah was trying to be the hero of his own, and yet the Lord still provided a way for salvation to come to these people who fillet people alive. Like, fillet people alive. Like, I would be more scared of going to that, but instead Jonah was like, they didn't deserve to be saved, is how Jonah was. He didn't believe they deserved to be saved. So for all of us, I just want us to know, stop running in the wrong direction. Run in the right direction. God is there with you all the way through. And I want you to know he's not running after you because he's already there. And he's not trying to pay you back when you get there. He's trying to win you back. And we can look at the cross and see that. So as we start this thing with Jonah and we learn a little bit about Jonah, some of it's a review. I would challenge you, 17 verses. Spend some time going back in those 17 verses over this next week. We're going to be in Jonah 2 next week. Dig in there. See how far apart that was and how far Jonah tried to run. And yet God in his grace and mercy had a big old fish come swallow him up when Mr. Long John Silver came swallow him up and brought him back in. Right? Brought him back to Nineveh here in a moment. But yet Jonah still missed out on the joy of that miracle because he was so wrapped up in himself and dead religion. So that's all I have for us tonight. Easy peasy lemon squeezy. We're going to hang out here for a minute and pray. If you need anyone to pray for or with you, please shoot us a message. We'd love to do that. We're so thankful for you hanging out with us. Join us next week as we continue Jonah 2. And remember, the best is still yet to come.